Right, I'm so excited that there's almost a packed room. That's really exciting. Welcome to Inclusive Digital Products, Why Web Accessibility Matters. I'm Karagaulrapp, and I'm a front-end developer at Message Agency, where I also oversee our web accessibility initiatives. For those of you who don't know, Message Agency is based right here in Philadelphia, and we're a full-service digital agency. We're a certified B Corporation, and we work with nonprofits, universities, foundations, government agencies, and other mission-aligned nonprofits. We're a social enterprise, and we help nonprofits use technology to enlighten, educate, engage, and enact change. So a little bit about me. For the last 10 years before coming to Message Agency, I've worked primarily in the education technology space. In the past, I've developed digital literacy curriculum for students with learning disabilities, and I've designed a learning platform that focused on adult literacy and English language learning. With a personal mission to create an inclusive web, I'm a web accessibility advocate, and I'm here today to help you guys become advocates as well. So I'd like to give you guys a little bit of an outline for today's session. I've broken it into questions that hopefully by the end of this presentation we'll all have some answers to. We'll start going over what exactly is web accessibility, where it started, who it governs, and other background information to level set ourselves. Next, we'll be going into why we should care about web accessibility, both in a humanitarian and business sense. Then we'll talk about what you can start doing right now, or more realistically on Monday, to make your projects more accessible. We'll go over different tools and strategies that you can implement at every stage of your project. And then before we go into our Q&A portion, we'll talk about some tactics that you can start or continue to make web accessibility a priority at your organization. So what exactly is web accessibility? In our physical world, we understand why we have ramps into buildings and push plates on doors. We understand why signs have braille and other accessible features in our physical world. It's so we can provide access to areas, information, and functionality that any given person may need. And web accessibility is an extension of that. And it's an extension of those considerations. It's a set of best practices and guidelines that reduces or removes the barrier to entry. It's used to ensure that all users, regardless of limitations, have equal access to information and functionality. So where did these standards come from? They come from the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C, which is led by the inventor of the internet, Tim Berners-Lee, and he has this great quote. It says, "The power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect." The W3C, for those of you who don't know, is an international organization that sets protocols and guidelines for ensuring the long-term growth of the web. Inside the W3C is the Web Accessibility Initiative, which published the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 1.0 in 1999. It's also called the WCAG for short. In 2008, this same initiative published the 2.0 guidelines of that, which is now considered the standard. So these guidelines have been around for 20 years, so this isn't a new thing. And that's a really long time. But what are these guidelines? WCAG divides its guidelines into 4 different principles. They're perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. When we think of perceivable, it means that information and user interface components must be presentable to users in a way that they can perceive. And basically that means is that our functionality cannot be invisible to all of somebody's senses. So examples of this are when you put alt text on images. As a sighted user, I know that this is a picture of a cat, but if I am using an assistive technology like a screen reader, I need alt text so it can describe it to me. This also comes in the case with closed captioning on videos. Even with YouTube, they provide closed captioning for us, but sometimes they can be a little funky with what they actually come up with. But closed captioning helps people who not only need to be able to read that, but it helps for people who have cognitive disabilities. We learn in a bunch of different ways. So some people learn best when they have multiple ways to digest information. Perceivable also means that it's able to support assistive technology such as a screen reader. And so even when we're writing our content and designing our sites, we need to remove the reliance on shape, location, and color or sound to navigate. So for an example of like that is, see the highlighted text at the bottom of this document. Well, if I can't see it, I'm like, I don't know what highlighted text you're talking about. When we think about things for operable, it means that users must be able to operate the interface and that the interface cannot require an interaction that a user can't perform. So a lot of that deals with, if you have a mouse, but certain menu navigations are only accessed when you hover over it, that doesn't work for somebody who operates websites who just use keyboards. This also means that we can't have action timeouts on forms. I'm not sure if you guys have ever tried to purchase a ticket, let's say on Ticketmaster before, and you have like 5 minutes to fill out a form. Something like that isn't accessible. Some people need additional time and support in order to process that information. So somebody with a cognitive disability, they need to be able to have time to read through the form and not just process what's being asked of them, but to process what an appropriate response and what a correct response to those things are. So when we time out our forms, we're making a bigger barrier for people who might need a bit more time. And it also means that we should provide alternate ways of finding information, whether it means a table of contents or a sitemap. When we think of things that are understandable, it means that the users must be able to understand the information as well as the operation of our user interface, and the content or the operation cannot be beyond their understanding. So things like that to go back to a form example, we need to make sure that all of our forms and our form inputs, they're correctly labeled. If we're using a website that has a lot of unusual terms, it's recommended that maybe we have a glossary for that so users can be able to find the definition and understand what things mean easier. And it also means that we should be targeting our reading level of our content at a grade 6 reading level. When we think about what robust is, it means that content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted easily by a wide variety of user agents, such as smartphones, different browsers, and assistive technology. This also means that users must be able to access all of this content as technologies advance, and not just backwards compatibility. Content should also be well informed enough so that it can be parsed successfully by browsers and other user agents. And things like, correctly naming our user interface components, whether it's a link. I'm not sure if you guys have ever used a screen reader before, but when we don't use correct linking protocols, like I'm sure you guys have all seen like the learn more or the read more links. But, when you're getting that read to you, we'll read more about what, I don't know what the title of that is, I don't know what content that's referencing, and we're putting users at a disadvantage and not giving them an equal opportunity. So why should we all care about this? Now, we all know that it's the right thing to do, and we as project managers, designers, and developers, we're gatekeepers to certain, important information or certain functionality that could be needed by everybody. And it's our responsibility not to gate people off from that. And we need to make sure that every aspect on a web project can be accessed by anybody, regardless of limitation. And in our physical world, if a blind person came up to you and asked you a question, like you wouldn't say, oh, sorry, there's no room in the budget for that, maybe in phase 2. So why would you block these users from accessing content or functionality in our digital world? When we don't plan for creating accessible products and integrate ways for our sites to be used by different people in different scenarios, we're undervaluing people based on things that are out of their control. To be candid, we do not have the right to do that, and there's way too much of undervaluing of people in this world already today, so we need to make extra steps to make sure that we're creating inclusive and not exclusive environments. But, doing the right thing doesn't always convince people, unfortunately. But luckily, there's plenty of business cases that we can make to people in our organizations on why they should put web accessibility in the forefront. So first is our social case. And when we're thinking about social context for this, I've come up with a few little bullet points for why we need to think socially about web accessibility. And the first on our list is the idea that when you solve for one person, you're enhancing the experience for all. For instance, you may not have a vision limitation, but if the text on a website has proper contrast ratio that benefits a user with color blindness, when you're in the sun and there's a glare on your phone, well, you'll still be able to see that text a little bit better. You know, and also when we're thinking about our body copy and our fonts, using a sans serif font on our body copy with proper line height, it helps not only people with dyslexia, but it helps older people who maybe need to, you know, zoom in on their phones, or, you know, sometimes you see like the lift up the glasses and look at all of that. But, you know, we're helping people with dyslexia, but it enhances the experience for everybody. The next is the digital divide. Did you know that 10% of Americans lack high-speed internet, and this number particularly affects people that have lower income? When we conflate our sites with insane animations and we upload 3 megabyte images into our WYSIWYG, and I'm looking at you content editors, we're creating a barrier to entry. Things like compression benefit everybody, and something like this is going to become particularly more important when we think of what's going on with net neutrality. And when your site takes very long to load, you know, think about how long it'll take to load on somebody who has broadband access, but trying to like load that same site on a phone is a horrible experience for everybody. So when we compress our sites, good experience for people who have maybe even dial-up to the person who does have this high-speed internet. And so the next on our list is we're going to see a lot of first-time internet users in the next year. And for my numbers people, I got some stats for you. So by 2020, 1.1 billion people worldwide are going to be accessing the internet for the first time, with 23 million of them being in America. That is an insane amount of people. And now I've been on the internet since I was 5 years old, and I make websites for a living, so suffice to say, I'm relatively tech savvy, and I can navigate my way through atrocious information architecture, and I can pick up on user interface patterns fairly quickly. But not everybody's like that. So we want to make sure that when we make patterns in our websites, that they're intuitive, and we give clear instructions for when we're doing things like filling out forms. We want to make sure that those are clear and apparent. And if our functionality and our design patterns differentiate from common practices, we need to make sure that we offer information that can guide users and support them. We also want to make sure that we offer a way to undo or back out of tasks so users don't get stuck in a place where they don't know what to do. We also can't anticipate the reading levels and the fluency of our users. The WCAG says that you should write your content at a 6th grade reading level. So things like chunking our information, writing in clear, concise language helps this population digest your information. Not keeping your paragraphs into the big wall of text also really helps. We can even use things like icons to also visually tie certain content to some of this text. Now, from a technical standpoint, we're reducing development and maintenance times. Clean code means less support tickets for Internet Explorer 6 and for solving for like one-off devices. It also makes doing a site redesign much easier. Our second bullet, reducing bandwidth use and server load, has to, again, do with compression. When we pay close attention to how large our websites are, and we make an active effort to reduce its size, we don't need to worry as much as load times. And I think it's like you have like if your website doesn't load in like 3 to 7 seconds, people will just bounce from it. It's also, how many times our server is being asked to transfer data. If our site's compressed, we don't need to worry about those things as much. And then there's device independence. There's thousands of devices out there, and we can't anticipate who is accessing our website with what device. We can't possibly anticipate all of them. When we use correct semantic markup, it helps users who are using older technology still be able to use our products, and ensures that and it will also ensure that our products will continue to work as our technology advances, and it'll still work on the latest and greatest. The average lifespan of a website can be 3 to 5 years. At Message Agency, since we work primarily with nonprofits and their budgets are, pretty much set in stone and they rely on things like grants to get further funding, we strive for 7 to 10 years. And if you've ever had to migrate content from an old system, you know what a headache that can be. So by keeping our code and our structure clean, we can make that process a whole lot easier. So in the financial sense, by making our websites more accessible, we can increase our market segments. 15% of people in the world have a disability. And if we add that number to all those first-time internet users, that's a whole lot of people that if we don't make our websites and our digital products accessible, that's a whole lot of people that we're ignoring. It also helps with our search engine optimization. Google likes us better when we have well-structured content. When the Google bot can tell us exactly what our page is about, we rank higher. Using the correct semantic markup and a grading 6 reading level will help us do that too. Our direct cost savings really ties into our technical bullets on our last slide. From server load to maintenance, and even the cost of translating or redesigning a site is much more minimized since we're developing from our clean semantic code. And then also, probably the biggest money saver of all, we're decreasing our legal threat. And on the topic of legal threats, a little background on where these legal threats are coming from is, so the ADA, which is the Americans with Disability Act, was signed into law in 1990, and it prevents discrimination against groups that have historically faced many discriminations and many barriers. The ADA makes it illegal in this country for any government or business to provide goods and services to the public that are also not accessible to people with disabilities. In many situations, however, it can be challenging to establish what accessibility actually means. That's why the DOJ, the Department of Justice, which enforces the ADA, has issued the Supplemental Advanced Notice of proposed rulemaking to incorporate web accessibility into standards. Organizations are encouraged to use the WCAG 2.0 guidelines, level AA compliance, as a guide for digital accessibility. And who's covered under this? A wide range of agencies and companies are covered under the ADA. That includes state and local governments, which is a Title II regulation, and also what are meant as public accommodations, which are Title III regulations. And these are essentially like any business or nonprofit organization that serves the public. Title III covers a lot of ground, including restaurants, theaters, and schools, and it ensures that individuals cannot be denied entry to these places or denied by these services solely based on a disability. This also includes services that are provided through a website or other digital format. Okay, so this was a lot of information. So it might seem, it might be a lot to take in, and it might seem like a little daunting to start. But there are some ways that you can start incorporating web accessibility into every stage of your product. First is planning. Who in here is either a project manager or responsible for putting together scopes and budgets? When you're first planning out your project, be clear that accessibility is a requirement and that it is launch critical. It's imperative to build accessibility in and not bolt it on. When we wait until QA to worry about web accessibility and things that we need to meet, development slows down, we'll go over budget, and the design might even need to change. And then it seems like accessibility is a thing that's holding us up, or it's a problem, but in reality, it's just a process problem. We also want to map out exactly what conformance level we're planning to achieve and use the WCAG checklist to write the requirements and testing scripts based off of them. We want to be proactive and share these requirements across teams so everyone's on the same page and that there's time to answer any questions and address any implementation challenges. You may also find yourself in a position where you need to train content creators on making their web content more accessible. So starting these conversations early will keep your machine well-oiled. And then for discovery and design, do we have any design people, UX, information architects in the room? Hey guys, this slide's for you. When we're thinking of accessibility and discovery and design, there's a few things that we can do to ensure that our designs and our experiences are being inclusive to all users. And designing for accessibility comes with its challenges, absolutely. But good design and good designers tackle those challenges. If you're working with a designer and they don't want to, and they're struggling with either, implementing these, or they're saying, oh, well, no, the design can't suffer, get a new designer. And also, having an accessible website does not mean, or does not need to mean, that you have to have an ugly website. There are plenty of beautiful websites out there that are fully functional by screen readers and all sorts of assistive technologies. So one of the things that we can do is to start baking in this some of these different design principles. There's universal design and inclusive design. And what these are, they're both human-centric and empathetic approaches to design that put people first. Your designs will be stronger and more intuitive because of it. With accessibility, we consider things like vision, hearing, cognitive, and mobility limitations. But human-centric design, like universal design or inclusive design, encompasses accessibility, but then also takes things like your location, your gender, your language, your education, and your age into consideration as well. It's the idea that whether it's out of circumstance, choice, or context, people are diverse. As people use different approaches and tools to read and operate interfaces, what the interface offers the user should be comparable in value, in quality, and efficiency. And then for those of you that are familiar with personas, it's a UX strategy that basically we think we know who our users are, so let's start putting some names and faces and attributes to these people. So one of the things that you can do is start putting in personas with limitations, whether they be temporary disabilities or permanent disabilities. And this is a way for us to just, when we're going through mock-ups and when we're going through wireframes, it's a way for us to go back to our designers and be like, well, we do have this persona who, let's say, is either colorblind or somebody who can't use a mouse. Like, well, how are they going to access this? So it gives us a little bit more of a foundation and thing to fall back on. We also want to make sure that we're vetting our mock-ups and our wireframes. We want to check for things like color contrast and make sure that our things like form elements have labels. Even with carousels, they're a really popular web component, but we shouldn't be auto-playing those, because people who it takes a little bit more time to process information, or people who are a bit more sensitive to changes in their environment, something like that's not a great experience for them. So we either want to not autoplay them, but we definitely want to have a pause button on those things. We can still have these things like a mega menu, but we want to make sure that we have a skip navigation link that's in place. I'm not sure if you guys have ever used a screen reader before, but when there's no skip navigation link, every time you go on a web page, it will read out the navigation over and over and over again. So if you have a menu that has like 90 links in it, that's not a great experience, and it's forcing the person to listen to that redundant information over and over and over again. And another thing too is we also want to make sure that we're testing. There's no use building something for empathy if we're not going to be looking to those users who we're building an empathetic product for, if we're not looking for their feedback and input to see if what we're doing is actually working. Do we have any developers in here? All right. So while we're in development, we want to actively be checking the status of our accessibility. We can use tools like the Wave extension, and even Google's DevTools has an accessibility auditor that's right in there. We can also use a command line tool like Pally that can give you insight on how you can increase your compliance. I'm personally a fan of the Site Improve extension, because when you run it on a certain page, it'll break out your errors and your alerts by responsibility. Well, maybe this is something that needs to be fixed in the development, or maybe this is a content editor's responsibility. So giving that type of insight, I personally really like. And when we create our accessible websites, we're using correct and meaningful semantic markup. This helps users who are using older technologies still be able to use our products and ensures that our products will continue to work. We can also add the WAI ARIA roles and labels to our elements when they're necessary. And this stands for the Web Accessibility Initiative Application Rich Internet Application. And what it does is it allows us to add roles and properties and state information to dynamic content. For the developers out there, you know, we use divs for things all the time, but that really doesn't mean a whole lot of anything to a browser. So by adding certain types of these roles, it gives a bit more context to these assistive technologies. We also want to artificially limit ourselves and use assistive technologies during the development process to make sure that the changes that we're making are increasing our accessibility and not making them more inaccessible. Whether it's just tabbing through the website or using if you're using an Apple computer, you actually have a whole suite of accessibility tools. When you're using things like this, you'll probably pick up on things that you wouldn't normally have had if you're just checking out your website and browser stack and, you know, checking for mobile responsiveness. So if you guys are Apple users, both on your computers and your iPhones, you can use their VoiceOver app, and they have a bunch of other baked-in accessibility features that I highly recommend you guys checking out. So now we can get to the topic of retrofitting, audits, and how you can maintain these sites. Because the strategies that we talked about are really great if you're in the position to be rebuilding or doing considerable development work on your site. But if you're not in that position, then you are in the position where you have to either retrofit your site or make an interim repair before a site redesign, there are still things that we can do to make things more accessible. The first is identifying if these changes are something that you can do yourself or if you need to contract an outside vendor for. If you don't have the capacity to do it in-house, you'll need to look at vendors. You'll want to make sure, though, that these vendors have experience specifically with your industry and even more specifically with the types of technology that you're currently employing on your site. If you're going down the do-it-yourself route, make sure that you have a clear set of expectations and milestones that you can reach, along with a timeline for how you can implement these changes. And accessibility audits are a great way to identify where your site is lacking in accessible functionality. But before we get into our next topic, I want to make a quick note about accessibility audits. So what an accessibility audit is, it's a checklist of whether or not your site is meeting your organization's compliance success criterion. It's also a reference point of where a site is at a specific moment in time in terms of compliance. But it's also a roadmap for future enhancements to better serve users with limitation. But accessibility is not the end-all, be-all factor of like whether or not your site is truly a great experience for somebody who does have a limitation. While a site might be able to pass all the success criterion, it's highly encouraged to use actual assistive technology and survey actual users to see how you can make improvements. You know, and there's a lot of tools out there that we can use to like aid us in this accessibility audit, but they can only tell you so much. Sure, they can tell you if you're passing or failing, but in regards to alt text, they can tell you that there's alt text on an image, but they can't tell you if it's meaningful or not. A successful audit is done by an actual human being. We can use these tools to guide us and to give us insight that we might not have been able to pick up on, but it does absolutely need a human person to be able to interpret and go through all these things. The W3C actually has this phenomenal tool that that when I'm doing an accessibility audit that I use, and these links will be available on the Drupaldelphia website in this presentation, but it's called the Web Accessibility Evaluator Report Generator, and it walks you through step by step the entire process. Things from identifying what technology is on your site, the different types of content that are on your site. It also, you can also put in targeted web pages, and then once you do that, on the next step, it puts together a huge checklist for you, and you can go through page by page, checkbox by checkbox, and it makes like the whole thing way easier. And then at the end, it generates a beautiful report for you, so even better. We're also going to want to perform these audits at multiple times at different times. I recommend doing a full site audit around every like 6 to 12 months, and mini audits of your frequently used pages and functionality every 1 to 3 months. That also is to say that anytime we're doing a development change on a website, we want to make sure that we're doing a quick audit on all those pages that it affects. And also, if a design change is implemented, we should run it through either a color contrast checker and then also another web accessibility tool if necessary. So and then back to our third point is communication. We can't anticipate how users are all going to use our site, and if we are in the process of increasing our web accessibility or other things, but we know that there's shortcomings, we want to make people and our users aware of that. So having a page on your website that's easily findable, that maps out your web accessibility initiatives and your commitment to it, and also the time frames and what you're striving for, as well as offering a clear way for somebody to reach out and talk to you about their frustrations. Something like having a phone number that's not just an 800 number where it's like, oh, well, press 3 and you'll be connected in 10 minutes. Like a phone number with somebody's actual name. And when in regards to legal cases that stem from web accessibility, it's a lot of it comes from a user that has a limitation, has reached out to the organization, said, hey, I can't access this, or hey, I'm having all these problems navigating your site. Like, can you either provide me with the equivalent of it or help me out here? And the person on the other end or the organization just furthered those frustrations by either not communicating with them or just quite frankly not caring. And those are typically what brings out a lot of web accessibility lawsuits. So now hopefully I've gotten you guys to care, if you guys didn't already care about web accessibilities, but how do we get other people to care? Because in a perfect world, doing the right thing isn't reason enough. So here we are. So to get buy-in, we can start by using those logical business cases that we talked about in the previous slides. We can also use statistics around website usage to help drive your point home. Also, keep talking about it. Keep asking questions about it. Be a constant reminder that we're here to serve all users. Don't be afraid to ask your designer why it takes one click to get to an important part of your website, but it takes somebody who's using a keyboard 10 tabs to get there. And it's also best if we get people from across teams to be a part of this initiative. It's not solely the responsibility of just the developer, just the designer, just the project manager to make sure we're meeting compliance. It's all of us. It's all of us in our organization. So I want to leave a lot of time for Q&A because sometimes the standards can be a little bit difficult to parse through. So before we hop into that, I just want to give a few closing thoughts. The words disabilities and special needs, personally, have always bothered me. We call them disabilities or special needs because people who have them sometimes require more assistance or more support to perform the same tasks as other people. But these aren't special needs, they're functional needs. And when we start thinking more in terms of functional needs, suddenly the word disability is irrelevant. If everything was accessible from the sites that we create and our apps to how we communicate and share information and to how we teach and learn, then we'll just start to see that we're all people. Our physical and cognitive differences are just that. They're just differences. They're not hindrances, they're not limitations, and we only see them as such because sometimes we make our products and our environments that way, unfortunately. But it's our duty as humans, as advocates, as good corporate citizens to create inclusive environments that can reach as many people as possible. So I empower all of you to go out into the world and become an evangelist for accessibility and to make other people in your life evangelists as well. So, want to open this up for questions? Who's up first? Yes.
Do you have any more to say about how to how to use screen readers and other technology, assistive technology, more regularly, and I don't know, either in the development or the QA process?
Sure. So if you're using like an Apple product, you can go into your settings and toggle on VoiceOver. But I will say that there are a bunch of different assistive technologies out there, and anytime that I've tried to, anytime I've used like VoiceOver, I always have like the shortcut keys like up right next to me, because it might take us like a little bit to go through it, but for somebody who uses this every day, it's like they're in the matrix, like how fast they can use these things. For Windows, I know there's JAWS, which I believe is paid. There's a bunch of really good ones out there. But I would say that it's definitely worth it if you're in the position to advocate for a training session. There's a foundation, it's like the Carroll Center for the Blind. You can actually contact them, and they will bring people in who have the sighted limitations, and they'll show you how people will use your website, and then also train you on how how you yourself can do it.
Do you find that they're pretty similar? Like the different screen readers, like say, I'm using Linux and my teammate's using Apple, they all kind of the same thing, like a browser. You can kind of. Yeah, I mean
they'll perform relatively the same, like because it's reading the same thing. There will be certain differences. And there's also like a myth that like screen readers, they like don't pay attention to like JavaScript, which is not the case. So there will be some differences amongst like screen readers, and how you use them. There'll obviously be different shortcuts and all of that. But if as long as you're testing it with one of them, like you're already beyond like what a bunch of other people are doing. Do you have a question?
The organization you mentioned, I've been told that the best way to have your site tested is to have a non-sighted person actually test it in a screen reader the way that they would. Does that organization offer that, or do you know of organizations or companies that people can contact, or where to get started with? Where would you get that testing started?
So you can a lot of organizations that serve people with disabilities, they usually provide that type of service, but also reaching out in the accessibility Slack channel or something like that. There's not a whole lot of us accessibility advocates out there, but boy are we passionate. So a lot of times you just have to ask somebody, but it is important to get these things tested with actual users, because even like I was saying, like I can go through my voice, I can go through a website with VoiceOver, but I'm not the most effective person at VoiceOver, so my experience is going to be way different than somebody else. So I would recommend looking into organizations in the area, especially if they can send somebody out to you. So look for people that are close to your area to help accomplish that. But I definitely recommend the Drupal groups on accessibility, and then also the accessibility Slack channel. They're invaluable resources to help get you started.
So I'm currently in a fight with my principals about, they want to include a PDF as the key component, sort of drilling down to the very center of our office purpose. Mm-hmm. And compounding that, the guidance that we've received, I work at Penn, the guidance we've received from the Office of General Counsel is basically we don't think we're going to get a Section 508 complete, which is bothering me because I guess it's an ethical issue, even more than a legal or anything like that. And has the thinking on PDFs changed at all? I mean, especially the ones that are created from a document as opposed to scanned.
So there is actually a lot of initiatives around PDFs, because when you're creating it, if you flatten that or you do when you export it, you reduce the file size, a lot of times that text gets flattened. So it's, when somebody's looking, not looking at it, if somebody who can't see, if they're trying to read that, it's just blank pages. So there is actually there's a lot of cool stuff that's happening with making PDFs more accessible. If you want, we can touch base a little bit after this, and I can share some links with you. But there, from the way that you even create the PDF, there's certain like export options that might be, that are often overlooked, but can increase the accessibility nature of the PDFs. But also, at the very least, if you are a very like PDF heavy website, offering either a text equivalent of that somewhere on the website, or providing a phone number or a form to fill out that says, hey, if we're giving you something but you can't access this, please let us know, and we will get this information to you. You first.
So this is a little taking it beyond just interacting with websites and technology itself, but more talking about accessibility in development and design. So for example, there's a lot of, my parents are deaf, so I have, my first language is American Sign Language, so accessibility is very important to me. But there's a lot of my friends who are also studying computer science and who want to become developers, who are designers, who are in graphic design or web design, all over the country. And that's just one example, but what can groups and companies do in the hiring process to remove the stigma against hiring people with disabilities and also making those sort of functional adjustments, or what did you say? Functional needs for people in there, because I know the ADA does protect, but I do understand a lot of people feel self-conscious about applying for a job and they feel they might be not included in the process, and even little things like messaging or using Slack if you're blind, is that the best resource? So where do you think the role is in trying to encourage more designers and developers that are part of that might identify as disabled in some way but are functionally, they don't identify themselves as disabled but they recognize they need additional assistance, and how do you think that will impact ultimately development and design as a whole and work towards creating better design and development internally?
So I will say that getting there. So when you have an organization, you definitely need to be inclusive. You want to, just like how, we'll hire, people of different ethnicities or different sexual orientations, and we consider that, we don't discriminate against anyone because we have all of these people. But, you also don't want to discriminate against people who have, what we call disabilities or limitations. Previously I worked at I had mentioned that I worked at a education technology company. What we did was we designed digital literacy curriculum to make students with cognitive disabilities work ready. Because just because, maybe it takes you a few more minutes to process things, doesn't mean that you're incapable of doing things. And I think as we get, I also think that as more people are coming into the workforce and as younger generations are coming in, we're just by nature, I feel a bit more empathetic. We're not necessarily just looking at, financial cases for we're looking at things, well, this is the right thing to do. So I do think that eventually, web accessibility, there's not going to be that many sessions on it because it's just going to be something that we do. But, I would say that as, if anybody is, in a hiring position, don't just see somebody who has a limitation as somebody's they might need extra support. They are still smart people like you and I. They're still highly capable people. Sure, they might need, additional support to do things, but that doesn't take away at all from, the intelligence that they have and their, and their work performance. So I think that, if there is, so for the people who are designers or developers and, and they might have these limitations, I would say, so what, apply for that job anyways. I think that, more people are becoming more empathetic, and I think these conversations may happen less and less, but it's important to get the ball rolling on that. But definitely.
If possible, can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
Okay. if we continue as like developers and designers and project managers and this is all of these fields that go into creating a positive product, would it be, I guess this is the moral question, is it the responsibility of those who identify maybe they're deaf or blind or have physical disabilities, responsibility to be sort of the tester and interact with the products? Or is that just something that's going to be like is it moral to just sort of assume that person will handle the testing of it or create very specific tasks? Because I just am wondering like if that's going to be an issue, or just try to inform the team or something like that.
I think anytime we make any type of assumptions, it's, I personally believe it's wrong. But having somebody on your team who does use these assistive technologies, view that as an opportunity. Being able to, maybe they're able to train other people on how to do it. Like, sure, they might spearhead it at first, but, knowledge is power. So, I think that it would be wrong to assume that just because somebody uses these things that this is now their job, this is their job role, and that every QA thing has to go to this person. But I would view that as an opportunity, or let's say if I was in that position, try to take the stride on that, be like, hey, this is how I use, like, let's have a lunch and learn, and learn how to use these technologies together. Because it's also, it's just not efficient to just have one person doing all of these things. So it would, but I think just also being like, a lot of communication, being like clear about those things, and moving forward, like, sure, maybe I'll do this now, but I want it to be an organization-wide effort, or at least have other people in this company know how to use these assistive technologies as well.
Thank you.
More questions?
I did have one about the PDFs. We actually were experiencing something where we had a glut of legacy PDFs, and we were trying to understand if the Acrobat tool to check accessibility was good enough.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have thoughts on that?
I'm a big fan of this saying, don't use one tool, use many.
Right. We tried to look for different things, and
yeah.
like all the places we looked kept pointing back to that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just curious what other tools there are to check PDFs.
There are some open source tools that are available as sometimes as plugins to our PDF creators and editors that we have, like Adobe Acrobat. I think that Adobe does a relatively good job at seeing how accessible something is. They also have a really great blog on accessibility. If you guys haven't checked it out, I encourage it. So I would say that it's definitely a start. There are some open source tools out there that might be able to give you a little bit more insight, but Adobe's usually pretty good with the tools that they put out.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
With enhancements coming up in technology and these tools that they're leveraging becoming even stronger and using AI, how do you see the future of being accessibility having to be contained on the website side as opposed to more so on the tool side?
So one of the things I'm really excited about with AI and like machine learning is, and I kind of touched on this a bit with when on the audit slide. So our accessibility tool, accessibility checkers and tools, they can only tell us like so much. They can't tell us like how meaningful things are and in context if it's really working or not. So I think that with the evolution of AI and machine learning, we're going to see our tools get way better, and it's like the integrations that we can have with our own products where maybe we can't even push things to live because we have these flaws in our system, and they'll know that they're flaws because they're going to take over the world one day and they know exactly how to use everything. So I think things like that are really exciting. I think there was another part to your question.
Just like, what do you think the future is like? Right now it seems like there's a lot of onus on the websites themselves, right, to try and keep up with those standards, but knowing there's many more websites than there are tools, at what point do you think that's going to flip and that the tools will have to have the onus of being able to know more about the websites and make them more accessible from their perspective?
I think anytime that you're in a position where either you're creating a tool or you're creating a framework, like take Bootstrap for example, if you guys are familiar with the Bootstrap framework, accessibility is like baked into that, and they're open source, and they say, well, if we're going to release this into the wild, we're going to take the responsibility of making sure that we have features and things that will make your job easier to bake in accessibility into your products. So I think at a certain point, it is definitely, as a tool creator to make sure that you're providing enough features for people to make their applications and people who are like leveraging your tool more accessible. But on the other side of that, like if you are using, a tool, you can't say like, oh, well, this module isn't super accessible, so it's like, it's on them, it's like not on me. Like that's also not an excuse. Because we also have I was listening to this one talk that actually Hallie, my project manager over here, shared with me, where they had, now I lost my train of thought. But anyways, there was, so basically with, when we're using like all of these tools, it was around how we have all this great web technology out there, and one of the reasons why people with limitations and disabilities get really pissed off when we don't have accessible websites and content is because they know that the technology is out there, but we as the people who are creating it, we're not leveraging that technology to make our websites more accessible and inclusive. So at a certain point, it always does fall onto the person who is creating that tool or service to make sure that they're the ones that are, meeting certain compliances, because you can really only blame a tool so much. Have some more questions? Okay. Well, thank you guys so much for coming to our session today, and I'll be around all today, so feel free to come and chat with me. I don't bite. So my name is Kara, and hope I get to see you guys soon and go out there and make some great products.